Thank you so much. And what a wonderful introduction. Certainly I appreciate it deeply. As was mentioned, I am the state representative for the 103rd District, which encompasses Champaign and Urbana, and I serve in a various roles as a leader in the General Assembly. I'm honored to be here with you all today, and so the University YMCA is a staple in this community, and it's a staple in my life. I've been volunteering here for a number of years, since my son, who is now 22, where did he go? He's right here. Stand up for a minute. I'm here. I'm sorry. Nobody else to do this, right? This is my 22-year-old son, Amir, who also attends classes here at the College of Aces. For a long time. So I'm honored that he is here. Good afternoon to all of you. In recognition of the love of my life, Clerk Aaron Ammons, who is also here, I want to thank him and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule while we're in the election season. The election has started. You can vote at Brookings from 8 to 4:30, 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Fridays. But I'm happy that he's been able to be here this afternoon. And to my staff, without whom I could do nothing. The ongoing issues in our communities cannot be redressed without the staff that helped me. My chief of staff, Andrea Porter, she's here. You all need to know who she is, because if you need me, she's going to get me. Stand up, Andrea, please. And this beautiful presentation that was put together by Sally K. Carter, who is my communications staff. Would you please stand? She directs all of our communication. My interns who are in the back, if you all would stand, all of you who are interning in my office, I have 2 PhD fellows as well as students. So today, I'm hoping to reveal an awakening that has happened to me, that has cleared my view of the work and the needs for true equity and justice for all people, especially for Black people who have suffered under some of the worst atrocities ever documented, and some that have been hidden. The title of today's talk is Abraham Lincoln, but I cannot leave out Frederick Douglass, who was instrumental in the experience of Abraham Lincoln and what we will talk about today. In order for me to understand myself, though, and how I show up in the world, it has been required that I maintain and transform the way that I think. One man from one position, being an enslaved person, Frederick Douglass, watching the institution of slavery up close and personal, and the other watching the institution, which was doomed to fail in reality, up close and personal, as his wife's family owned slaves, President Abraham Lincoln. So, something's happened to my speech here, but it's okay. The world that Lincoln inherits is one filled with contradictions and imperialism that seeks to justify and sustain these atrocities of unspeakable measure. So let's go back for a moment, just for context, to the parents of America, Britain. So I asked myself, what and who authorized what became known as the transatlantic slave trade to us, or as we have redefined it, as the illegal trafficking of people of African descent? More and more African Americans today are discovering their heritage, and yet millions of descendants of enslaved prisoners of war are looking to understand why we have and continue to suffer in America, as we have contributed to the level of growth and the wealth of the country untold. So who authorized this? Today I'm going to use some terms that some may know and some may not have known, or maybe some have forgotten. The importance of these terms will define where we will go with this speech. For this talk is really just about me, and you all are simply witnessing what I have learned. What I have learned specifically is that the people of African descent, better known as Afro-descendants, by a 2002 19 countries at the UN Conference of Rights of Minorities, in La Ceiba, Honduras, to recognize people of African descent whose ancestors were enslaved in the Americas as subjects of international human rights law. Specifically, the term refers to Black peoples whose ancestors, number one, were forcibly disposed from their homeland, Africa. Number two, were transported to the Americas and slavery diaspora for the purpose of enslavement. Number three, were subjected to slavery. Number four, were subjected to forced mixed breeding and rape. Number five, have experienced, through force, the loss of mother tongue, culture, and religion, ethnocide. And number six, have experienced racial discrimination due to lost ties from their original identity. So back to Britain for a second. At this time, European nations had finally ended their 100-year war and aggression among each other. They soon turned to seeking other lands to dominate and loot, and the papal bull, decree of the highest order from the Pope, gave permission to the Portuguese to trade and to take over the infidels. It's called the War of the Dumdiversus, declaring that the victims of the Dumdiversus War and subsequent transatlantic slave trade initiated by Pope Nicholas V on June 18, 1452, the papal bull, as is known, Dumdiversus of 1452, was addressed to Alfonso V and conceded Portugal's right to attack, conquer, subjugate the Saracens and pagans, and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, their duchies, counties, principalities, and other properties, including their human property, to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. The English, who didn't want to go against the church, had their own idea, the imperialism called the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery was issued as a charter to the explorer John Cabot in 1496. The English issued charters and formed various charters, proprietaries, and royal colonies to establish the jurisdictions of America. The first charter of Virginia of 1606 granted America's British forefathers license to settle and colonize America, and guaranteeing future kings and queens of England would have sovereign authority over all citizens and colonized land in America. This is the America that would become and would be built on the exploitation, trafficking, and murder of Afro-descendants. Afro-descendants are persons of African origin who live in the Americas and the region of the African diaspora. As is stated here in that definition, African people on the continent already had fundamental rights of African people that took expression in something called the 42 Ma'as. African societies already had their own natural law. And so when the Europeans engaged with the Africans, they brought what they considered a universal law or a new law that they eventually deemed as international law. The natural law gave African people the authority and power to oppose, deny, resist, revolt, and defend all territory from invasion by Europeans. But this royal charter affair continued. As we all know, to give an example, during the span of the transatlantic slave trade from 1501 to 1867, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were taken as captives, of which roughly 10 million were disembarked in the region across the Americas. These royal charters were given to places like Portugal and other explorers who did some 36,000 voyages that were documented in Davis and Lead's transatlantic slave trade database. Thomas Cooper, in the supplemental to Mr. Cooper's letter on slave trade, suggests that for every 100 people with African lineage and heritage who were kidnapped, trafficked, and enslaved, 1,000 were murdered in European-inspired and exasperated warfare on the African continent and the Middle Passage, and 70 were murdered during the quote-unquote seasoning process, for a total of 170 million deaths estimated. We visited the last bath, what is called the Last Bath in Ghana, where people were captured, held, chained, and taken to the final destination where they would take a bath before finding themselves in the dungeons on the coast of Africa. Mapping this voyage, Britain, Portugal, and Brazil. Britain was and is responsible for at least 11,632 slave voyages and at least 3 million plus of the people who were forcibly, illegally, immorally transported from the African continent, thereby being responsible for the murder, kidnapping, and enslavement of 52.2 million people of African lineage and heritage. Cape Coast dungeons demonstrate the number of people that didn't make it onto the ship. The slave trade database that I mentioned to you is written here. Those databases chronicle how many people actually made it to the shores of America, but how many were also lost in transit. For example, Portugal and Brazil were and are responsible for at least 7,300 slave voyages and at least 5.7 million people who were forcibly, illegally, and immorally transported from the African continent, and using Cooper's order of magnitude, were and are responsible for the murder, kidnapping, and enslavement of more than 73 million people of African lineage and heritage. Elmina documents that on the continent of Africa. So Lincoln comes in 242 years after this whole scheme started. Lincoln takes his first public appearance in 1832. He doesn't win the first run for him to become state legislative member, and I'm honored to be speaking of him in the way that I am as a state legislative member many years later, after he faced one of the hardest political challenges of his career. So Lincoln comes on the scene, as you see, and I provided a timeline for those there. He doesn't win his first election in 1832. He runs again in 34 and wins a seat in the Illinois House of Representatives. He goes on to run 5 times, serving only 4 terms. The 5th term, he doesn't serve, although he wins that election, because he decides to run for the U.S. Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. And many of you may be familiar with the Douglas and Lincoln debates, and we have that in the Capitol today. But he understood at the time that he was going to be challenging a system that many people accepted as part of American society at that time. Well, Lincoln goes on and he loses the race against Stephen A. Douglas. He doesn't go to the Senate. He returns back to Illinois. He starts to make public appearances and speeches all over Illinois that are well documented, and I encourage you all to read his speeches. Lincoln comes back. Remember, Lincoln was not a Republican, and my Republican colleagues love to do this to us in the General Assembly. They get up and they do their speeches about the president, and they will do that on Tuesday, and they will say, Lincoln was a Republican. And I say to them, Lincoln wasn't your kind of Republican. Lincoln had a different kind of view than my current Republican colleagues. Lincoln starts off as a Whig, part of the Whig Party, and wins 7th congressional seat in the U.S. Congress. Eventually the Whigs fall out because this thing called slavery is bothering some of the members of the Whig Party, and so they split. Lincoln goes and they establish the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is a party that is trying to not only stop the spread of slavery west of the Mississippi, but they think it's not sustainable and it hurts the economy because, of course, white peasants who were coming and settling into the Americas didn't have jobs. I want you all to remember that, because I'll come back to that at the end. So Lincoln comes back after he loses his one single term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He comes back to Illinois, and he wants to remain relevant, so he picks up these debates. And he debates all over the state, and he goes to Ohio and several other places where the abolitionists are really on the scene, trying to abolish slavery. Lincoln became the first president of the United States in 1861. It has been 242 years after the first Afro-descendant prisoner of war appeared in Virginia in 1619. I had the privilege of visiting the spot that they were brought into Virginia. near the campus of Hampton University, a historically black college and university. And that was a very emotional moment for me because I know that these Africans had no idea what was about to happen to them, although undeserved. My point here is to underscore the importance of understanding the historical context of these events so that we can appreciate the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. Remember, this was authorized by the British government and governments all over Europe. And at no point has the British government, the US government, Spain, Germany, or any other European government paid reparatory justice to any of the countries or the people as a result. But we want to change that. For more than 6 centuries, or 30 generations, the theft of the fruit of the labor of the people of African lineage and heritage on both sides of the Atlantic, and the nearly incalculable wealth that it produced, has redistributed income and wealth earned by the people of African lineage and heritage on both sides of the Atlantic to generations of people of European lineage and heritage on both sides of the Atlantic, leaving the former impoverished as a group and the latter relatively privileged as a group. The year Lincoln becomes the 16th president of the United States, I don't know about this man's work, Martin Delany. Martin Delany is in the Niger Valley in 1861. Martin Delany is scouting it out for the return of the stolen peoples of Africa. And he said, the basis of a great nationality depends upon 3 elementary principles. First, you have to have territory. Second, you have to have population. And third, you have to have a great staple product, either natural or artificial, or both, as a permanent source of wealth. And Africa comprises these in almost unlimited extent. Now this has to be a cruel joke because France and America, who are some of the richest countries on the planet, are getting most of their wealth and resources from the very continent that many of us grew up being taught not to visit. We were told it was a jungle, wild animals, the mosquitoes will kill you, don't go there. However, when I did finally go, I saw a lot of Europeans in Africa. 1861 is a year that we look at how we're going to proceed as a country. Lincoln is really faced with some serious challenges. He knows that he has a group of people that are in bondage that is not sustainable and he must take action. The abolitionists thank them for their work and pressure on President Lincoln, the congressional members, as well as John Brown was on the scene at the time. And John Brown has taken all of his sons to fight the evil scourge of slavery and gave his life to it. The very next year, Lincoln tries to solve the economic question. He introduces the Homestead Act of 1862. And what's important about it, which I will not read all of this, but what is important I'd like to highlight on the Homestead Act is if you look at the eligibility requirements on the screen, you will find at the very bottom of it, the top 2 is a little challenging for Africans at this time because we are not recognized as citizens of the United States. We also don't have $10. So although the congressional members wrote this bill as if it's innocuous and it's available to everyone, the eligibility requirements in it tells us that it's not. And there is absolutely no way that the Homestead Act will apply in this year to Africans who are enslaved. Thank you. So what did the Emancipation Proclamation do in 1865? Now, we've given away millions of acres of land in 1862. Lincoln writes the first proclamation in 1863. It doesn't get actually adopted into law until 1865. You've given away millions of acres of land to undergird the white peasants west of the Mississippi, but those who are enslaved are still without resources in order for them to survive. So the political destiny of the newly freed, enslaved Africans manipulated by the same people who allowed and maintained their enslavement for hundreds of years. Black soldiers still fought in the war. Our service in exchange allegedly was going to provide us citizenship. But we will see later in this presentation that it becomes a struggle continuously for Africans to live and receive the same rights as the white citizens of America. During the Civil War, President Lincoln was reluctant to recruit black soldiers. This was made possible, though, once the proclamation was passed. The first black regiment of the Civil War were comprised of recently freed black men. United States Colored Troop, 175 troops with 178,000 black soldiers, in addition to 18,000 men and 3 women, were entered into the U.S. Navy. Excuse me. Those who were unable to serve in the Army were sent to something called freedmen labor colonies. Now, to my professor in this room and all of the scholars in this room, I thank you all for what you do. Because I'm simply a student of yours, and I'm learning all of these things by way of you directing me in the right path. I look up and find out, which I had never known until really recently, about the freedmen labor colonies. Remember, you freed, emancipated all of these people who were always humans, and they knew they were always human, but they were manipulating the process by force and brutality. Once you freed all these people, they didn't know what to do with them. So Lincoln has this meeting, and they say, hey, well, what are we going to do with all these newly freed people? Or they call them slaves still, which I find that to be interesting. He says, what do we do with all these newly freed people? They made the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the first year that they started trying to figure out what to do, was July 2nd, 1864. And in that act, they authorized these freedmen labor colonies, but most people don't even know what they are and what happened at the labor colonies. The people who are put into these open-air prison concentration camps, called freedmen labor colonies, were brutally treated, even by the Union soldiers who were supposed to be protecting their rights from the Confederates. But they didn't quite do that. So the question of what to do with these 3 million enslaved people was answered by either putting them in the army or putting them in freedmen labor colonies. The 13th Amendment was supposed to protect the rights and allow you, as an African, to receive the same treatment as Europeans in America. But that did not happen. Millions of our ancestors were killed, buried in mass graves in many parts of the South. If you take a moment and look up the history of Natchez, Mississippi, you'll find some of the history around the freedmen labor colonies. At this moment, there is a break in a meeting that has to take place. So, you all know about, of course, the United States Secretary of War, Edwin McMaster, and General Sherman, who went down to Savannah, Georgia. And they went down to Savannah, Georgia to meet with some leaders of the newly freed people. And they asked them this question. They said, what would you all like to do? What would you like to see? I want to pause there, although it's not on the screen. You will see it in a few minutes as I talk about this. Every people who has been displaced in the world have received what's called a plebiscite. There have been 14 plebiscites in the world since World War I. And many of those people, their leaders are convened and they ask the people, what do you want to do? Where would you like to go? Where would you like to be? How would you like to be resettled? In this case, they went and met in Georgia and they asked these leaders the same question. And the overwhelming response was that we would like to live in a territory of our own. We are a stateless people. We do not have a state at this time because we are not recognized as full citizens of the United States yet. And we also have not been returned to our homelands where we were taken from. So we are considered in this modern era international law as stateless people. But they didn't follow through on that, did they? President Lincoln heard from the general and said, hey, we're going to give you the Southern Territory, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, to be the territory of the Negro, they called it. Within 1 year, Lincoln is assassinated. The new president, Andrew Johnson, comes in and he reverses all that the Emancipation Proclamation did, including returning all of the land that had been just given to these newly freed people, returning all of that land back to the former slave masters. He also issued an order to pay any of the plantations and plantation owners to pay them reparations for the freeing of those who were enslaved in their territories. So now we're stuck here, and we're looking at this plebiscite concept. Today we have 42 African Americans in the United States who still have not been asked, what do you want? We have not been surveyed as to whether we deserve full rights of every citizen in the United States, because of course we have significant difficulty in employment, in education, police brutality, mass incarceration. All of these are continuations from the same type of policies that created this in the first place. And we are seeking to self-determine. Self-determination is the right of every single person on the planet, but it has been systemically denied to African Americans. And we are seeking the return of our right to self-determination and to have and establish a national plebiscite. As we move, you can move on. The consensus now for change is pretty clear of what needs to be done. African American children are failing miserably in K-12, and 36% of African Americans dropped in enrollment in higher education. This is a real crisis, but no one's talking about it at a crisis level magnitude. But the consensus of reparations and the question of reparations among African Americans surveyed at 77%. So why haven't we gotten reparations? Why haven't we repaired the harm of generations of enslavement and Jim Crow and white terrorism and KKK and policies out of our legislative bodies that disenfranchise the same people who descend from those who built the wealth of the country? I hope we answer that by the end of this talk. In order for us to really get to the bottom of this, we have to establish who indeed are descendants of those who were enslaved. And we've taken actual legislative action to do that. And I'm honored right now to introduce Professor David, who is here, and I know she didn't expect it, but I'm on her slide and she has to stand and we have to clap for her. Why we're clapping for her. Because I worked with my interns over the summer, and I had a meeting with one of them. Her name is Jaylene, she's in the back. And I said, hey Jaylene, I just did my African ancestry. And you know how much that thing cost me? I said it was $300 for me and $300 for my husband. That is ridiculous. We are a descendant of stolen people. How do I pay a commercial company to tell me where I came from? That's utterly ridiculous. I said, we should do something about that. Do you know any scientists that study this? And she said, oh, yes, I do. And I said, wonderful, call her. And so she did. She got me on the phone with Dr. David. I expressed to her what we were interested in, and lo and behold, her research as an anthropologist is exactly what I was looking for. And so she began to teach me about something called autosomal DNA. I am not going to try to explain that because that's out of my pay grade. But what it does do is what we asked for it to do, which is to reconnect me back ethnically to my homeland, people, and culture. So we filed a bill, and we passed that bill last week in the General Assembly Committee on Human Rights. So Lincoln's history crosses this because Lincoln understood that he had to give these people their right to determine. And he came up with a scheme that didn't include black people to send us back to Haiti or send us back to some other part that he came up with. But he did understand that he could not send these newly freed people to another land without resources, without congressional appropriations, which is reparations. And he wrote the bill himself to do that. It was a failed effort for many reasons, which we won't discuss now. But many generations later, African Americans, by and large, cannot afford and should not, in my estimation, pay a single DNA company to and that should be covered by the government, who also caused the problem. So we will pass that bill and fund it with the help of Dr. David, the University of Illinois, the Department of Anthropology, and the Center for Genomic Biology, who will help us trace 900 descendants in Illinois. It's our first of its kind pilot program in the United States to trace your ethnic lineage and reconnect you back to your home community. Aaron said potentially, but the potential is always great. So we are honored to be able to do this from this community. The University of Illinois is a land-grant university and has a land-grant mission. One of the things that I appreciate about coming to events at the University of Illinois is the acknowledgement that we stand on the lands of the Native Americans. And just that acknowledgement alone is good. But we can do so much more to recognize the people who actually built the buildings, who were enslaved, who worked the salt mines of Illinois. We have more that we can do, and the research is right before us. And so part of this work and this talk today is to, one, appreciate Lincoln and his vision. It was very, very difficult for him. I'm an elected official, so I understand. It was a very difficult period where people didn't want to end slavery, and they went to war literally against each other to prevent the ending of slavery. So that tells you how difficult the political climate is. But it also gives us a glimpse into the kind of things that we need to do to correct the issues of the past and the wrongs that have ensued as a result. We cannot argue for democracy in other places that we don't provide in our own country to the most vulnerable and the least that can afford it in our own states. In closing, I wanted to introduce a few local projects that are happening that I am asking those who might be interested in partnering with us to do this work and research. On the slide here, I've provided for you a couple examples of local reparations initiatives. We had a visit from former Councilwoman Robin Rue Simmons from Evanston, Illinois. How many of you all have heard of the Evanston Model Reparations Plan? Oh my God, that is great. Wonderful. That work gave us a glimpse of what local governments can do, because believe me, the national government, the international government are not alone in the maltreatment of African people. It happened in the local communities as well by local policy and local jurisdictions. And we seek to explore our own community's history, and we need your help for that research. And so we've taken to learn from the Evanston's model so that we can do that right here in our own community. And because of Reverend Jeff Trask, Professor Dr. Jeff Trask, who is also here, raise your hand so they know who you are. The church, the New Covenant Church, has established the Champaign-Urbana Reparations Coalition, which is a social welfare organization dedicated to seeking reparations for African American people locally. They're currently working on projects to support the African American community here that include research examples of reparations nationwide, locally as in Evanston's case and other cities, as well as national reparations initiatives that have been introduced like HR 40. We seek to expand our work around reparations because that is the only way in reality to justice. We cannot do it through programs like DEI. I know you guys might like that, but the reality is you cannot close a wealth gap that is built hundreds of years ago by DEI. That doesn't work. You have to repair the harm where the harm was and move forward from that point. To not do that is to ignore the obvious and the lack of accountability that is necessary. HR 40 has been introduced for decades. It has been rewritten and reintroduced many, many times. It's a national piece of legislation that's initially sought to study reparations, but because of institutions like the University of Illinois, we've already done that. So they changed the HR 40 to be an active resolution in the Congress, and we seek its passage. This is a very, very small step. And I'm gonna say something because I have to. To have a congressional member to represent the 13th congressional district who is opposed to H.R. 40 is problematic. As my representative in the congressional space, where we have the grossest inequality this country has ever experienced, to be opposed to something like H.R. 40 tells me a lot about what the Democratic vision is in Congress, and that we have said we don't have the money to pay reparations, but we are paying many, many reparations all around the world. Tupac said you got money for women, can't feed the poor. So let me conclude with an action. Two of them. One is I introduce you to Mr. Jeff Trask, who's in the back, who has the meetings on Thursday nights. I think at 6 o'clock? 6:30 at New Covenant, downtown Champaign. We're looking for researchers to help us do this work. If you're slightly interested, or you're just interested in coming to sit in and listen and hear what's being talked about, we encourage you to do that on Thursday nights at 6:30 at New Covenant's Fellowship. And number two for today, because I have lots of actions I do. Number two, I have begun taking a diplomatic course with a former graduate of Yale University who has repatriated back to his homeland after doing a similar study of Guinea-Bissau. And in Guinea-Bissau, he has introduced, utilizing H.R. 292, which we passed last year, calling on the national government to recognize the rights of African people and the right to return, the right to dual citizenship without barriers, and the removal of visas for us to travel the African continent. He has done the research and provided a diplomatic core course, of which I have made myself a student. I am welcoming any of you who might be interested in taking a diplomatic core course with me. I have brought my books, the curriculum books, with me if you're interested in taking a peek at them. I will leave them on the desk. Please do not take them by mistake. I know. But this is an important part of the work because the research is necessary, and I will tell you why. When we filed H.R. 292 and passed it in the Illinois House, we sent that resolution not only to the United States Congress, but we sent it to the UN. And we asked them to adopt the resolution similarly. I was notified just before coming here that the country of Colombia, South America, literally adopted our resolution, our House Resolution 292, last week. So that is available for you. And lastly, I also wanted to put on this page the work that you'll see here in these books are done by Sigwe Baleka, who was a national Yale swim, what do you call it, U.S.
He almost made the Olympics.
He almost made the Olympics. I mean, this guy is like seriously famous swimmer, first black swimmer in Yale. He has written all of these books, and he advises governments around the world on building reparations plans for their people. And lastly, Restitution Study Group was out of New York City. They focus on two things. One of them is corporate slavery era disclosure notices. And the second one is the return and the recognition of African artifacts that were used to trade or steal African people. Deirdre Farmer-Pellman is an attorney, and she works with an attorney out of Oxford who have filed lawsuits against several very large corporations, which I won't name because this is video right now. But she has filed these lawsuits to recognize their complicit role in the transatlantic slave period. Finally, I want to thank you all for your time. Lincoln is an important part of my experience in my life and my work. And I have studied him from the Zealot and the Emancipator all the way down to his speeches that are very, some less known than others. But what I will say that he understood is that he understood there was no way that America could survive as a divided nation. And today we are experiencing a similar kind of sentiment. I do hope that the people in this room are those of the humanitarian focus that will not join the effort in division, but will join the effort in bringing back the diplomacy as well as the democratic principles that we all say we believe in. Thank you all so much for lunch. Is that okay? We have 10 minutes if people want to ask questions that I may or may not be able to answer.
I don't always have to be first, but I like to keep moving. I'm more critical of Lincoln, frankly. I know you said that the quip about his Emancipation Proclamation is to free the slaves in the states where he had no power to free the slaves, only in the slave states. And there are other things you pointed at that Haiti wasn't recognized for 60 years because it was the first slave rebellion. But Lincoln recognized it, and you think that maybe that's a positive, but it was because he was looking for places to colonize African folk here, too. So it's a much more complicated and nuanced thing. If he hadn't been killed, maybe he would have evolved. I don't know. I'd hope so. That would have been Johnson, that's for sure. But anyway, that's not a question. But I did want to point out that Lerone Bennett's Junior Force into Glory it's #1 in the African American community and deserves more reading in by other people.
Well, I certainly appreciate it. Look, Lincoln was a complicated fellow at a complicated time. He was also one who really didn't want to be equal to blacks. I get that. I also understood that Haiti was not recognized, and they still mad at Haiti today for fighting for their own freedom. It's the complication of white supremacy that we need to get rid of. We need to get rid of racism and white supremacy so that we can think clearly and see people as human beings as opposed to property or less than other people and otherizing folk.
Hi. I just wanted to ask if the recording of this will be available.
Thanks to Paul, it will be. It'll be on UPTV, he told me, next
Friday at 2 o'clock.
Friday at 2 o'clock.
It's on West Radio this coming Wednesday, the audio only, obviously. So, and it'll be on demand on YouTube, UPTV's YouTube channel after next Friday.
Yeah, and I just wanted to emphasize how much I'm trying to educate myself by reading. Anyway, but a couple of books that I've finished recently is Bury the Chains and The Color of Law and Just Action. And they're really good educationally for anyone that wants to learn. Thank you.
All the way back.
First, Representative Ammons, I want to applaud you for doing something that very few people have the courage to do, and that's raising the question and identifying the fundamental crime against African people, and that was the taking of sovereignty. That those hundreds of African nationalities and ethnicities that were molded in slavery into the African American, the fundamental crime was the loss of sovereignty, and the fundamental solution is self-determination, as you pointed out. I do want to raise a slight criticism. Those hundreds of Africans that became, through a creolization process, the African American, are one people. A nation, we used to say a nation within a nation, but the United States is not a nation. It's an empire. A multinational empire that oppresses hundreds of nationalities right around the world and inside the country. But the fundamental goal then is that particular African people, the African American, their right to self-determination includes also the right to be an independent nation state and not simply dispersed on the African continent amongst other peoples.
I appreciate that Martin Delaney's, in his writings that I just saw last week, he made that argument and said exactly that we should, if we dispersed all around the African continent, we would not be able to work together because we didn't grow up in the culture, right? So we need to be able to build a nation state of our own so that we have the right to self-determination. So I understood Martin Delaney's attempt there, and you know, of course, as a scholar, that there are many others after Martin Delaney. You know, Mari Obadali, who also put the same proposal together, but Paul Robeson did too, saying we deserve the right to self-determination and to live in a nation of our own. We have not realized that, but we haven't recognized the thing you said, which was fundamental crime. It has not been held, there's no accountability for the fundamental crime that creates today's problem. And that's what I hope that we can do.
That's why I applaud you.
I just wanted to give contact information for the Champaign-Urbana Reparations Coalition. We are a new group. We do have a website, so you can locate us there. And the meetings are every third Thursday at 6:30 at New Covenant Fellowship. It's not every week, so we're pleased. Carolyn has joined us last night, and we're pleased to join her efforts towards reparations.
Thank you for clarifying that. Anyone who wants any information can certainly reach out to my office, just state CarolAmmons.com. And we'll get you in the right direction. Thank you all so much for your afternoon and for lunch, and thank you to the Y. Thank you to the Y.